I've actually been scared to do this today because, well, number one, I'm not Schweitzer.
You're a friend.
I'm a friend, yeah. And I want to say something about that. Oh, you guys, you're so good to be here at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning. I have a handout, but no test. Okay, I'm gonna start. Some of you should feel free to leave when you've stood long enough. I said, I am so honored that you've come. Some of this material's a little bit hard to hear. I'm calling it The Land We Came To, Homelands Become Homesteads. And as I started to say already, first let me be clear, I am not Schweitzer. So you can ignore all of this as the rambling of a Low German. I'm in the friends category of the Schweitzers and friends. I actually, you won't believe this, I didn't know about Schweitzers until I came to Bethel. For my Turpin, Oklahoma Mennonite church, where we were a ragtag group of latecomers, Crimmers, Low Germans, Mennonite brothers. Some of us had been on the Asian track. All kinds of immigrants come late to no man's land to farm, form a church community, and eventually join the General Conference. But a couple of my Schweitzer roommates at Bethel could not hide their derision when they learned I was Low German out of Russia. Are you kidding, Rayleen? I wanted to smack them, but I so loved their mom's Bonabruggy cake that I wouldn't have thought of doing it. No, I had my sophomore year, Cynthia Weedle Jansen was my roommate, who is gone now. My junior year, Joni Garing Brubaker was my roommate, who is not well. And they both took me into their families, and so I certainly became an honorary Schweitzer for at least those 2 years. Had so many good times in Moundridge, and Moundridge has felt a lot like home ever since. Second, let me say that I did not come today to throw our ancestors under the bus. I have a deep appreciation for our Schweitzer and Low German ancestors who came in 1870 to 74 to farm. I wrote the book East of Liberal to honor my parents and ancestral lineage for their sacrifices. They all came to survive. They came with their own historical and family traumas. I cannot know. A need to give their children a future. They were courageous, they worked hard, and they gave us a rich inheritance and the good lives we live today. My own paternal ancestors had no time to even think of their own history or pass it down. I knew nothing of the Hinz history. They were a few Lutherans who were aboard a shipload of Mennonites on the Teutonia in 1874, and they had arrived in Malachna, the village of Paulsheim, from Danzig only shortly before they departed from Hamburg for the U.S. They joined the Mennonites at Hoffmannsau, brought in by Dietrich Gettert after their arrival, and they began farming on an acreage at the intersection of Dutch Avenue and Burton Road, northwest corner. In the 1885 census, they seemed to be doing very well. They had 160 acres of land, 840 rods of hedge fence. They had planted 120 acres of winter wheat, 15 acres of corn, and 1 acre of Irish potatoes. They had 300 bushels of corn on hand. There were 10 acres of prairie under fence. They claimed 8 tons of tame hay, 12 tons of prairie hay cut in 1884. The family had sold $10 in chickens and eggs, had made 100 pounds of butter, and owned 9 horses, 3 milk cows, and 2 other cattle. They also had 11 pigs, had lost 2 horses, 1 cow, and 1 pig, and had slaughtered $60 worth of animals. On the farmstead were 200 peach trees, 2 apple trees, 114 grapevines, and 1 dog. And children went to Oklahoma. We've never found our great-grandfather Christoph Hinz's grave. He had a harness shop in Burton when he died. His wife, my great-great-grandmother Johanna Freitag Hinz, is buried in the West Zion Cemetery in Mound Ridge. My Schweitzer connection. I come today not to consider so much our ancestors and what they did or did wrong. This is about us and who I am in this history. We who have lived on these homelands of indigenous peoples for 150 years and benefited from their use. My conviction is that we should at least know something of these homelands we came to. And this is not out of guilt. Guilt is not a very productive emotion, feeling, conviction in this whole enterprise. And I think you'll see that as I move through it. I have long embraced the first quote on your sheet, the Nikki Sanchez comment, "To settlers' children like us," found in Healing Haunted Histories, that very useful workbook for settler accountability if you're interested. This history, says Nikki Sanchez, is not your fault, but it is absolutely your responsibility. We must begin with how we saw the land as farmers, and continue to. I've traced my own lineage back through 10 generations of farmers. These are all Mennonites. My Lutheran, I can't find my Lutherans. They're not on grandma. My people were, I can go back 10 generations from the Netherlands to Moravia, Prussia to Russia, and I learned this all in a trip I made to Poland some years back. We have a deeply entrenched view of the land as farmers. We see the land as a rich resource, a way to make a living. Soil versus the sentient earth with spirit and a will of its own. Compare Kiowa Chief Satana, who argued the land does not want to be farmed. And I will read to you a further comment about that, which will understand why he felt that way. He implied that the land has a will, that we should try to discern what the land wants, recognize its long history, and treat it as a living organism. This little book, Becoming Rooted, has become a precious resource to teach me to understand indigenous attitudes toward the land. It's on your sheet. Randy Woodley in Becoming Rooted, and I have this as quote number 2, 100 Days of Reconnecting with Sacred Earth. I started reading, he has like 100 days of meditations, which I do every day. And when I finish the book, I start over. It is very, very hard to learn different attitudes about the land and life. And these are indigenous thinking. And I just find I have to keep retraining myself. He says the very land itself meant something different to the newcomer than it did to the host people. Something was missing. The difficulty as the natives saw it was with the settlers themselves and their failure to tread lightly, with humility and respect on the land. The settlers wanted to live on the land, but the host people lived with the land. Living on the land means objectifying the land and natural resources and being short-sighted concerning the future. Living with the land means respecting the natural balance, end quote. I also want to read to you a quote of how Chief Kiowa saw the farmer. He said this, "We've always lived on the land. Then you came. First the traders. That's all right. We needed blankets and kettles. Then the soldiers came. Then other men came. They are farmers. They want to work the land. That is not all right. The land doesn't want to be worked. Land gives you what you need if you're smart enough to take it. This is good land, but it is our land. You kill the land. When you do that, the buffalo will never return." You can imagine him watching the prairie being torn up. What does it mean to see the land as a mere resource for human use? I want to start with a book that I found incredibly powerful and it's pretty hard to read. It's called Running Out in Search of Water on the High Plains. And Lucas Basier, who is an OU professor, grew up about 40 minutes north of where I did, on ranch land and farmland in southwest Kansas. He sets out to understand how the Ogallala in southwest Kansas came to be so depleted, and he ends up trying to understand the attitudes of the farmers there today about water use, especially that of the irrigators who continue to suck the Ogallala dry. He makes sense of this, and it hit me between the eyes with an early chapter he titles Bones. Excruciating detail of the slaughter of the bison in our area in southwest Kansas. Now, we've all heard about how the bison were killed in order to commit genocide for the Native Americans who depended so wholly upon it. Let me just read you a couple of passages from this. I learned that 1872 was the pivotal year for settler colonization in southwest Kansas. The land was surveyed for the Santa Fe Railroad, whose tracks raced west down the Arkansas River Valley from the camp called Buffalo City to Grenada. Their construction stopped and hundreds of track workers were laid off. They found a new market for buffalo hides. Thousands of hunters were involved. Some wrote memoirs. Frank Mayer said he came to southwest Kansas because he felt restive. He heard buffalo were walking gold pieces. I was young, I could shoot, I needed adventure, he wrote. Wouldn't you have done the same thing in my place? Western Kansas went what Mayer called Buffalo Wild. He said this wildness was like a gold or uranium rush. Men left jobs and families and sold whatever they had to get to the game. I did it myself, and why not? It was a harvest. It was a harvest. We were the harvesters. And then this one, most of the meat was left to rot. One settler who wanted to sell hams fed his hogs with buffalo. A fraction was shipped east as so-called Texas beef. Sometimes tongues were smoked or pickled. The hides themselves were tanned for industrial machine belts and European military accoutrement. Everyone seemed to take the abundance for granted. And finally, newly arrived settlers likened the bone-strewn plains to a field of white lilies or a charnel house. Bone dealers paid between $4 and $12 per ton at the railroad stations. Poor homesteaders called the bones a godsend and a wise dispensation of providence. They broke the skeletons with hammers and axes. It took around 100 skeletons to make a ton. Kansas settlers reportedly earned more than $2.5 million on bones from 1868 to 1881. Imagine this, if you're a Native American anywhere within sight. But the reason Lucas Basier writes this chapter is to make his argument that somehow those who came to the plains saw them as a resource and turned immediately to commodification. He argues in the rest of the book that today Southwest Kansas farmers see the water just as the 1870s buffalo hunters and settlers saw the buffalo. Use it up and then go on. He goes to water meetings in Southwest Kansas where they say, yes, we're going to have to use up the Ogallala and then we'll turn to the Colorado River. Our land is worth nothing without irrigation. We can't sell it unless it is irrigated. We have no choice but to use up the water. This is the very definition of commodification. Imagine this from a Native point of view. I also think of the fact that we saw farming as God ordained. In the history of my own Turpin Mennonite church in the Oklahoma Panhandle, we see settlers who so wanted land to farm that they completely disregarded whether it was sustainable farmland. They traveled to Beaver County in 1900 to explore the possibilities of farming in no man's land. The land looked good, they thought, but the people told them it never rains there. The old patriarch argued, no, but if people move up there to live, God will send the necessary rain. That is precisely the attitude that caused the Dust Bowl. In the 20s, during years of rain, grassland was torn up, millions of acres, and carpetbaggers planted wheat, went back home and waited for it to be harvested. Farming was believed to be God ordained. And the land was not being properly used unless it was farmed. Some of my relatives who farm Cheyenne allotments in central Oklahoma to this day do not understand why they must rent the land from the Cheyennes because they are not using it. The half section of sand I grew up on 3 miles east of Liberal should never have been broken for farmland. My father heroically tried to farm it for a quarter century, but that land, I can tell you, is much happier now. For 40 years returned to grassland. My own come to Jesus with regard to seeing homelands turn to homesteads, which is the theme of my little talk today. Understanding my own family's, my own farming ancestors, perhaps unknowing complicity, though it seems unlikely, this unknowing complicity. And the near genocide of the Kaw people, the for whom Kansas was named, came as I was reading Ron Park's The Darkest Period, the Kansa Indians in their last homeland, 1846 to 1873. The Kansa people had lived along the Kansas River for hundreds of years. Many of you perhaps have heard or read in the news the story of the Sacred Red Rock, which was their altar, which was stolen by Lawrence settlers and recently returned. It's now back around Council Grove on the site that the Kansa people are restoring on their former homelands. They were pushed off the Kansas River as settlers flooded into that whole Topeka area. And so they were moved to a new reservation around Council Grove. It's this story between the years of 1846 and 1873 that Ron Parks tells amazingly. But that was the worst place they could have possibly put a reservation. Along the Santa Fe Trail, preyed on by other tribes who now they were in their way on their lands. And the Kansa people were already a small tribe. I should say Kansa, but I'm so used to saying Kansas that I say Kansa when I shouldn't. So it was a devastation. But above all, the settlers wanted their land, described by a newspaper man checking out the Kansa reservation in 1870 as beautiful a country as lies in the Neosho Valley, and yet it lies uncultivated, the home of a squalid, dirty, idle, mischievous race of Indians, end quote. To a farmer's eye, this land was vacant. We have never recognized homelands as anything but vacant land. The Kansa people would leave on a hunt and return to find squatters in their homes. All manner of atrocities were committed against them to get them to give up their land. So the Kaw people consented to be moved again, this time to Oklahoma, where they still have their area today. In a moving passage described by Parks, he says that in the weeks before their departure, the Kansa women made trips at dawn and dusk to the hilltops around Council Grove, where their loved ones were buried. Each grave site was marked by a patch of sunflowers that would bloom in late summer. Quote, seated with backs to the sun, they wept and howled until their pitiful wails could be heard for miles. The local newspaper, the Council Grove Democrat, bid them farewell with these words: to Morris County their removal has long been a looked-for blessing. They occupied one of the finest bodies of land in the state, mostly embraced within our county limits. The land is now in market, will soon be settled up, And instead of a few hundred lazy, filthy Indians, we will ere long have a dense community of farmers living upon land that will add to the taxable wealth of our county. End quote. Now, here's the thing that struck me. This was written in the Council Grove Democrat in June 1873. Only a year later, in September 1874, my ancestors came to Kansas looking for farmland. My great-grandfather Edgar and his brother record in their journals arriving in Topeka, where delegations from their number scouted nearby sites having potential for farm settlements. The first place he notes that they visited was Council Grove. They didn't like the water and journeyed on to Hutchinson. A couple more other stories as we look at this notion of homelands. John Ruth, any of you know who he is? Great old Mennonite. He's a Schweitzer. He was among the first Mennonites, his people were among the first Mennonites to come to this country. John Ruth tells the story of his own Mennonite people coming to Pennsylvania. In a recent book that he wrote when he was 90 years old, or at least it got published, he'd been working on it. This very ground, this crooked affair, a Mennonite homestead on Lenape land. The book came out in 21. And he tries to tell the story of what happened on that land. It's his own land acknowledgement through three contemporaries, William Penn, Sassunan, his own ancestor, Sassunan was a Lenape chief, his own ancestor, Hans Stauffer. He tries to tell a corrective for what he calls a Mennonite lack of curiosity about their neighbors and the land they were on, farmer arrogance, he calls it, and ignorance. The second quote on your sheet, the third, is from John Ruth's preface. On the living room wall of our restored ancestral farmhouse, and he still lives on that land, glows a motto in antique German, Die Erde ist des Herrn, the earth is the Lord's. We have braided this Hebraic dictum by which our Anabaptist forebears lived and died in Switzerland, with a dated sequence of owners' initials beginning with those of William Penn, 1684. Only in old age are we wondering why we omitted reference to ownership far prior to that of William Penn, the English Quaker, who sent the first surveyors through the woods of what he'd wished to rename Sylvania. It's a hard read, it's a long book, it's packed with research, but you learn a lot. One problem Ruth encounters in his attempt to do right by telling the history of the Lenape people his ancestors lived among is their lack of written records. He will just tell you in this book. Much of this is musing about what might have happened because obviously the Lenape culture was oral and the Mennonites didn't bother to write down anything they learned from them. He laments again and again that his ancestors record no interactions. Well, there's a brand new book, Kathleen Duval, Native Nations, a Millennium in North America, recommended to me by my friend Randy Crable. I might have found it eventually, Randy, but I found it when I needed it from you. She tries to look at 1,000 years of Native history from about the thousands to about 2000. For me, this was so important for me to see these homelands as not vacant. What was going on there? The thriving life, the long cultural histories. So part one looks at the thousands to about 1750, the great ancient cities. And part two, one chapter of which I want to review for you, is called Confronting Settler Power, 1750 and Beyond. And the chapter about the Kiowas is really instructive for us because it covers this big area of the plains. One of our problems is we have not used native records. We assume they didn't keep records. They were a savage people. They didn't read or write. Well, they kept very careful records called winter counts. And some of you have probably read about these, but the Kiowas drew one picture each winter and one each summer to record the momentous events of the year. And these calendars had a revered record keeper, a kind of sage in the tribe. And it was kept on bison leather, and when this wore out, after decades of being carried around and studied, it was carefully transcribed onto a new leather skin. Umberto Eco, the name of the rose, onto a new leather skin, and so it offers decades of history because it would be passed on to the next scribe. Furthermore, I thought this was such a wonderful distinctive. It was a group history. People gathered to look at the calendars for reference and to discuss what should be pictured this year. What is our most momentous summer event? What is our momentous winter event? It's not a particular historian's perspective, but a recording which reflects communal life, the life of a people. So, for example, in 1833, Kiowa artist Little Bear drew a beheading. Kiowas called it the summer that they cut off their heads, or the Osage Cutthroat Massacre. It's a record of what happened as the tribes pushed into each other. As settlement proceeded west, obviously conflicts that had not existed before, because people generally knew whose territory, or they fought for it and redistributed it and figured out whose homelands were whose in this huge swath of plains land. But as people got pushed into each other's territories, there was lots of conflict. So let me just briefly, for 2 minutes here, talk about Kiowa's lives on their homelands before we got here. So they were dominant in the plains in the 1850s, about a generation before our arrival. There were European settlements here and there and trading posts, but the Kiowa thought of them as an anomaly. They ranged over huge, vast territory. What is a little trading post here, a European settlement there? The Louisiana Purchase territory, the way we've always seen it on the maps, was native nations. Our maps never marked that. It was the Louisiana Purchase, this big glob of land. Think how inaccurate to a native point of view. To the Kiowas, in the 19th century, European and U.S. posts were basically stores, trading centers. Santa Fe, St. Louis, San Antonio, Laredo, Chihuahua, towns of a few hundred, maybe even a few thousand, existed mainly for the purpose of native trade and a little local agriculture or ranching. They would basically ignore these as any kind of threat because they were much more concerned about the Osages and the beheading. These are the kind of things that got recorded. And now a little backdrop for the Kiowas. This is so interesting because I myself have always thought of the plains as empty before we got here. The plains were wild territory filled with buffalo, as we know, and wild horses brought by Spain. And the horses had changed plains culture. Bison were hard to hunt on foot. Think about it. The Kiowas had once taken large numbers of men, women, and children, the whole tribe, to herd the animals over a cliff, the buffalo, bison, over a cliff, and then pick off those who survived the fall. It was difficult. They managed only 1 or 2 hunts a year. Life was much, much harder. Living the rest of the time, a fairly sedentary existence in river valleys on the edges of the mountains, the Kiowas came down out of the Rockies. Farming, fishing, hunting for smaller game, deer, rabbits, for the horse. with the use of the horse, Plains tribes like the Kiowas, Crows, Cheyennes, Lakotas, Comanches became nomadic. And they almost entirely abandoned agriculture, still gathering like wild plants, but they went to these trading centers for corn, beans, tobacco, with the tribes that did remain sedentary, like the Osage, Pawnee, Wichita, or the Pueblo communities. We don't have a clue how far they ranged horseback throughout this whole area. These were reciprocal economies. They made allies with certain people, traveled horseback in all seasons. I wrote about the Comanche in East of Liberal because I was stunned. I was stunned that Liberal, Kansas was in the northernmost tip of the Comanche Empire. The Comanche had an empire for 70 plus years from Texas to southwest Kansas, and they held off the Spanish, the Mexicans, the US for 70 years because of their horse culture. Both the Kiowas and the Comanche were fabulous horsemen. They leapt from horse to horse at full speed like the movie show. They hung onto the side of a horse to hide their bodies and fired at their enemies, protected by the horse. Men and women were equally skilled on horseback. Children rode so early that they had to be roped into their saddles. Horses created a new worldview. You see in their art, the Kiowas thought of themselves as centaurs. They were one with their horses. As nomads, they could suddenly pick up and leave if they didn't get along with their neighbors. They could range, and other tribes, all over the plains, they were ranging. Huge herds of horses required huge grazing spaces, and obviously this was finally the death of the Comanches. They didn't just wander, the Kiowas, they planned. They developed new ceremonies, songs, dances, all related to these mounted adventures. Their weaponry changed. They're horseback. They can use smaller shields and smaller bows. Status is totally reflected by one's horses. So they finally had too many horses and couldn't maintain an area. Their bodies changed. They couldn't run fast like the Pueblo people. They were horseback. They gave horses to followers, to diplomats, to allies, to one another. Lawrence Hart told the story of his parents' betrothal, and it involved the bringing of a horse to his mother's teepee to request her hand. Storytelling. Kiowa grandmothers told of the hard times when they had to walk and carry all of their belongings on their backs, and wooden sleds pulled by dogs like our grandparents talked about walking 5 miles to school in 10 below. Gender roles changed. Women got the shaft, as usual. Gender roles, women organized the moves of thousands of people in the tribe, making sure everyone had enough to eat and drink on these long nomadic excursions. And among the Kiowa, successful hunters married multiple women to keep up the workload because the women dressed the bison. And they hunted so much more than those 2 hunts a year they had done when they were much more sedentary. They had huge summer celebrations, Sundance with their allies. Not so different from what I have attended with the Cheyennes with Lawrence Hart today. The Kiowas stayed a month, and here is where they made their calendars, recited their histories on the calendars, so I can imagine. To tell the children, you rolled this thing out and you looked at the momentous events of each year, and the people who were still alive told the stories. Planned marriages, raised war parties to avenge a death or to raid an appealing target, maybe a little like Beowulf around the fire. This is what homelands looked like. Thriving economies, alive. So when the Europeans began arriving and told them, this is American land you're on. The great white father in Washington owns this land. The Kiowas were like, what the heck are you talking about? There's nobody here. We've been here hundreds of years. That little trading post doesn't own the land. They gave these little groups horses, trying to make trading deals, and were not impressed with the reciprocal gifts of knives and combs. and vermilion paint. Kiowas didn't see these early explorers and settlers as any kind of a threat. But of course, as we know, the Americans kept coming. After the Civil War, it was an onslaught. Just 9 years before the date we're commemorating today, the Kiowas, Comanches, Plains Apaches agreed to the Little Arkansas Treaty, promising they'd stay south of the Arkansas River and away from the Santa Fe Trail. Treaty assigned them reservation land in Texas and Oklahoma, and they said, well, okay, but that's not U.S. land. And then the Treaty of Medicine Lodge, and things got worse and worse. The Treaty of Medicine Lodge is the first time they got it. This is the first treaty they found significant enough to put on their calendar. By 1879, 5 years after we were here, the inability to hunt had left Kiowas eating their horses. N. Scott Momaday, most important Kiowa writer, tells of his ancestors surrendering at Fort Sill. Horses and weapons confiscated, 800 Indian ponies destroyed, 2,000 more stolen, sold, given away. Silver Horn's calendar records for the summer of 1879 a horse-eating Sundance, a grotesque picture of a warrior with a horse's head engorged in his mouth and the rest of the body yet to eat. And then the Civil War. Duval describes how tens of thousands of troops came west, armed with repeating rifles. After the Civil War, what else did they have to do? It was kind of fun to fight. The rapid-fire Gatling gun. At the end of the Dakota War, the U.S. Army hanged 38 Dakota men, the largest number of people executed in a single day in the U.S. There was the Sand Creek Massacre, the Washita Massacre, the Homestead Act of 1862. In the 1840s and 50s, it had seemed possible that the U.S. would be content to take the fertile lands of the Mississippi Valley and leave the arid plains mostly alone, merely crossing them to get to the Pacific coast, not farming. But extensive agriculture became economically viable in the plains when steel and plows and other technologies enabled farming in large parts of Kansas, Nebraska, and Oklahoma. And then there was the railroad. Finally, I'm coming to the end. Some of you have been standing. Want to jump up and down a few times, John? I'm going to encourage us all to read a book that came out last year, The Cost of Free Land, Jews, Lakota, and an American Inheritance by Rebecca Claren. Especially those of you on Dakota land. I know we have some Dakotans here. Rebecca Claren is a highly skilled researcher and journalist, and this book took 20 years. She was already a reporter on the American West, assigned to a story at Pine Ridge in South Dakota. And there she remembered her Jewish family escaping Tsarist Russia's anti-Semitism to become immigrants on 160 acres of South Dakota prairie. The locals called it Jew Flats. Hers is a kind of John Ruth story in the early 1900s, beginning with family pictures she found of her own Jewish ancestors among the indigenous peoples. And she determined to find out what happened. What she does is, if I were 40 years younger, what I'd try to do. She learns to know the Lakota people. She learns their histories. She studies incredible numbers of records. In her attempt to tell the truth about the land, the federal government's removal of native peoples of the Great Plains to reservations and the granting of their stolen lands to displaced immigrants. It's so interesting because it's a Jewish, not a Mennonite story. And I recognize that the themes of our ancestral existence come to the fore as we look at farming for us. She writes about the always present concept of exile for Jews. And she said, they believed that owning land would be a hedge against exile, once and for all. Then she traces their wealth, and today she's trying to make reparations with that, with her family. It's, you know, though the Mennonites were considered backward by their American neighbors, they were privileged to be considered white. The Jews typically were believed to be neither white nor American. Just as in our own history, we might have given up the German language to be seen as Americans, Claren believes her people tried to behave in like-mindedness with the conquerors to be thought of as one of them, and she documents her own family's atrocities against indigenous people. She begins to study the Talmud, and if you've looked at Healing Haunted Histories by Elaine Entz and Chad Myers, a workbook for settler accountability, she talks about bloodlines, landlines, and song lines. And the song lines are the texts that have been most precious to us. Go back to your own story and your own people's understanding of how to live in this world and treat other people. And the Mennonites have plenty of good stuff to look at. What were their scriptures? What were their hymns? What were their song lines? Rebecca Claren does this with the Talmud. So she finds things like this that just mean everything to her. The Talmud says if a homeowner knows that even a single beam has been stolen from someone else, it's that owner's duty to make amends. The theft of native land, she understands, undergirds much American wealth, all of ours. Her work is to return what she thinks is her share of her family's holdings, as she says it in the book, our piece of the stolen beam. So, what does it mean that free land comes at a cost? That's her title. Certainly it's cost the indigenous people everything, almost genocide. What does it cost us, and how do we make repair? I would argue that the most important thing, and if that's all we think about today, is that we tell the truth. We tell the truth. We acknowledge that these were homelands, and we try to understand and dismantle the systems that were set down by the doctrine of discovery, that if the land was not occupied by Europeans, Christians, it was vacant. Farmers, it was vacant. So she tries to tell the truth. I'm going to skip over some of this last part, but the fourth quote is hers, and it comes when she's talking about reparations. I've been in a lot of conversations about reparations today, about what do we do about it. I found this quote really interesting. Reparation is a bank word, another commodification. With reparations, everything has a price. I think the bigger concept is healing. Reparations can be part of that or not. People talk about truth and reconciliation. Mennonites talk about reconciliation a lot, and conflict resolution. I'm not a big fan of reconciliation. This is her Native American source who happens to be a judge. I'm a fan of healing. You know, think about what reconciliation means. It means now you like me for whatever I did for you. Think about what reparations can mean. She says reparations are fine. That's fine, but only as a subset of something bigger. That means I've paid you, now be done with you. Mm-hmm. Finally, she says something in her book that resonates with that first quote I gave you. It's now the job of our generation, those of us who have grown up free of the kind of upheaval our ancestors went through, to do the work of considering the harms of this entangled history. I told you I read this every day, and when I'm done I read it another 100 days, trying to learn. And this time I really am closing. These are little tiny chapters each morning that help you to learn how Indigenous people think. And I love the one on berries. I'm just going to read you a few pieces of it. You'll get the point. To Plains tribal people, oh, the wonderful thing about Woodley is he's a Christian. He's an Indigenous Christian, so he knows how to talk to us. To Plains tribal people, berries are a rare treat. Whether they are bullberries or buffalo berries or choke cherries or any other variety, these jewels make life fun and interesting. They are fun to pick, especially for the little children. Invariably, when our family goes out to pick berries, my wife reminds the kids and now the grandkids, remember, these berries are not just for us. The birds and mice and other creatures get to have some too. As we pick, she reminds us, like her brother used to remind her, don't pick all the berries from the tops. Those are for the birds. And don't pick all the ones at the bottom. Those are for the small animals that can't reach up high. Pick mostly from the middle. Those are the berries for us. And he closes, how might you pick from the middle today so that the rest of creation has enough? Thanks. You want to comment? Or, I mean, some people want to get out of here where they can breathe. It's hot, I know. But if we have, anybody have, it's 10 till. I was going to stop at the bar.
Are you going to be posting this talk anywhere to where we can access it?
Yes, they are. They recorded it, right? And you know, I might not want to look at it, but I have some things that I'm going to put out on the table, or you can pick them up as you need them. The MCC dismantling the doctrine of discovery, if you haven't seen it. Land acknowledgements with my caveat. A land acknowledgement is a good start, but don't end there. I mean, don't say, okay, I acknowledge you, you lived here, I'm done. But, you know, in our church, I go to Bethel College Mennonite Church in North Newton. The land acknowledgement was a wonderful beginning that led us all kinds of other places, and we've been forever grateful, and we continue to build on that. I have those. I have my book, East of Liberal, and the Lawrence Hart book, if you'd like to have website. I'm going to give these it's $20. I have to pay for it.
Yes. Rayleen?
Yeah?
I really appreciate your comments on telling the truth. I've been an educator, as you have been, for all my life, and I would encourage us all to continue to tell the truth.
In your history classes.
Yes, and we're being taken captive by people that use the term cancel culture. Well, you're canceling the white culture. We've canceled culture for hundreds of years in public education, and it's time to go to your school boards and your teachers and put this culture, this lost culture, back into our schools.
And we can no longer say, like John Ruth does, I don't have the information. More and more, like the cost of free land, it is out there. And if we care to educate ourselves, to learn, to tell the truth, it's there. And it's exhilarating. I was going to say the cost of not telling the truth to us personally, or hiding from it, or pretending, is huge also. Yes?
I began working with Lawrence and Betty, Bonnie and I did, in the 70s. And out of that came the Cheyenne Hymn Book.
Oh, yes.
I'm Dave Graver.
Okay.
And we have needs in Montana for people who will connect music and dance with the culture, with the healing that's there, to understand what's going on with those aspects of life. I don't mean you need to learn how to dance and sing Indian. What I mean is there are things to learn about the value of song in the Alice book that Mennonites
Yes,
don't tell you, because
yes.
we need to learn how that
Yes,
connects.
like using the Talmud.
Yes, where a person's connections that are the most valuable aspect isn't something that we learn cognitively, it's something we learn because non-cognitive learning and non-cognitive expressions are really valuable.
Well, learning with our bodies.
With our
I
bodies,
remember
that's what
when
it
I
takes.
learned with my body to dance with the Cheyennes because they ask you to dance.
So we need
And
music
you
teachers
learn
in
with your
Montana.
body.
There are 70 schools without one, most of them Indian schools, because people don't understand just what you're talking about now. And I just really value what you said about Lawrence and Betty and the whole connections that we have. There's a beautiful thing out there for us.
Well, it's the joy of my life to have connected with Lawrence Hart, and that's where
You bet.
this all began.
Without their guidance, I wouldn't have done it.
Yeah. And putting up with a white woman's idiocy, asking the wrong questions. Lawrence used to just, I'd ask him a question and he would sit silent for a long time. And sometimes he would answer and sometimes he would just let me know, that isn't a question that I want to talk about. You know? One last thing before you leave that Lawrence taught me, which maybe will free you to, I have been so bound by my Christianity sometimes that I've been so regretful of what the atrocities committed by Christianity that I sometimes want to flee the whole operation. I remember the day that Lawrence and I had been talking about Mennonite missionaries come to Oklahoma. And I sat for a long time, I was almost in tears. Just the cultural, and I think Mennonite missionaries were amazing. They lived with the Cheyenne people. Lawrence thought many that they were amazing. Still, they were white, and they committed a lot of culturally inappropriate things. So we'd been talking about it, and finally I was kind of like head bowed, almost in tears, and I said, Lawrence, we should never have come. Long silence. Remember that Lawrence was also a Mennonite pastor. Finally, after he had let me stew and fret for a long time, he said, Rayleen, we needed the good news. Thank God you came. That has buoyed up my work for the rest of my years. Now, get out of here.
Unless we're staying for the next